Hello everyone, today we talk about the dialectic between princes and cities in late medieval Europe and more specifically in 14th century Flanders and Germany. For the latter especially expressing the importance, the historical legacy of the famous Golden Bull of 1356 that essentially set the basis for what would have eventually been expressed with the Treaty of Westphalen 300, not even, years later, as essentially the foundation of German secular states, the empire, very important equilibrium. But also, in fact, Flanders is quite fascinating in this regard because it is one of those intensely urbanized areas, albeit living essentially in a decentralized reality, right? Whether you take France as the point of reference, but also, and objectively, also the empire, right? It was bordering areas such as Brabant as well that would have been would have produced, in fact, the also an important charter compared to the Golden Bull and the Magna Carta in medieval European history, asserting those autonomies. And as we've seen often, and ad nauseam by a certain degree, so you probably hate me for this till the end of your days, the mid 14th century crisis changed a big deal of things, right? And in Central Europe, this was particularly evident already because of a previous, actually, disgregative process that has started from essentially the second half of the of the 13th century, and the generalized international crisis, also in the case of Flanders, that brought to this attempt of autonomization, would fundamentally maintain, right, on in spite of the various, let's say, the different outcomes of the clashes against the French, for a while, developing also an important identity and say homogeneous administration political practice by the end of the Middle Ages, however under the House of Burgundy, properly in the Burgundian lowlands. And the main picture that we witness in the crisis is, as we've seen, actually a refeudalization of Europe. As, again, I will repeat ad nauseam, the end of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, weren't at all an increase in individual liberty by any stretch of the imagination. It was actually the reverse. It was the crystallization of a strongly oligarchic feudal system that we call the Ancien Régime. And any kind of egalitarian or even humanistic, let's say, expression was actually stemming from an elite. And an elite that in part emphasized this rights, autonomies, representation, etc. Actually, in fact, from an oligarchic standpoint. This doesn't mean, however, that the rest of the community was not involved, right? But still, the powerful. In these Central European areas, we look especially the high nobility, together with meaningful convergences and connivences with the lower nobility and the mercantile class, right? Posing limits, more or less based limits, I'd say, to the arbitrium of the prince. And this naturally depended on the degree, let's say, of the power of these elements, right? There were areas, like especially I think northern or eastern Germany was heavily feudalized, still kind of very primitive. Other areas of the empire, and also, and especially just outside of it, Flanders, right? Areas of, in fact, old and solid urbanization, where it's the city that is dialectically posing itself, let's say, to coping with the prince in order to determine the measure of the reciprocal government control on the state as it's gonna be formed. What we're talking about, the term state is debatable in all times in history, right? It's an approximation right? If you don't buy the modernistic categorism for which the state is only the one that was created in the Renaissance, etc., you have actually a much healthier view of history in the first place. And you can appreciate this important political institutional effort to centralize by a degree. It is paradoxical that the refutalization, so in a way the reinforcement of private prerogatives, but at a higher level, and that's the point, managed to put together something more public and centralized. And in fact, what is really extraordinary of medieval civilization that didn't really happen with antiquity in the same way is that because of the terrible crisis of the 14th century, the system didn't actually fragment further, right? We'll see it especially with Germany. The fragmentation had happened largely before the crisis. It was the crisis that managed to recompaction. The same goes for Italy, for example, where the crisis brought to a drastic recompaction, even more than north of the Alps. And the 100 Years' War is not really a good example because there were two major countries that were already pretty big, that were clashing against each other. And so the crisis that you find is already in some kind of elephantiac, especially speaking for France, system that at the end of the war, by the way, came back on its feet like a unitary state. This is evident also in the Iberian Peninsula, where at least after the beginning of the 13th century, the major, macro areas, the Crown of Aragon, the Kingdom of Castile, and Portugal. Well, okay, there was Navarre in the northeast as well, but took that form, that shape, didn't essentially change further. But a further political institutional consolidation is to be found, albeit way more slowly, in Scandinavia, in Central Europe. In fact, as in part we're going to see now. And therefore, we are witnessing literally their modernity kicking in the form of more advanced and robust and permanent, at the end of the day, statal forms. Now, speaking of Flanders, well, in the 14th century, the Count of Flanders had to share, importantly, his power with the assembly of the so-called properly assembly of the three cities, right? That were naturally Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres, were the most important ones, the ones that had risen essentially against the French invasion, etc. And that, in fact, represented the political military bulk of the Flemish force. So, what does the Count do to try to keep this league effectively at bay? Well, he tried to counterbalance such power by creating some collegial organisms that would represent essentially the landowners, the clergy, the nobility. So you already see the tripartite order, where first, second, and third state in reverse respectively. Of where though? Because Ghent, Brugge, and Ypres were the most important cities, right? So of all the other urban centers, and also of the castle seigneuries known as the castellanies, that, as we've seen also in the video about the Flemish military organization, were essentially the traditional districts of the land, right? When, say, the urbanism had still not taken off, right? At least to be more important than the feudal institutions, Flanders was essentially ruled by those local lords that also in this time against France, etc., very often had sided properly as a knightly class, in part at least, with the aforementioned three cities during the revolt. But after a moment of, say, of depletion of the comital power that had already gone under since the 12th and throughout the 13th century, right, where the cities in fact had risen in importance. So the deal, of course, was, these three major centers want to somewhat, if not monopolize the control of the county, but at least being the most powerful element in it, and making, front against the other, in this case, the feudal hierarchy, what remained of it, and it was naturally backed by France in part, by channeling the efforts of all the other smaller centers that had somewhat, and the Castellanies that had to lose in part of their own autonomy because of the expansion of those aforementioned cities, right? This is not very different from the other, actually the most urbanized area in Europe and northern and central Italy, when leagues would be formed, would be a major power then, like Milan, and the emperor arrives to keep it at bay, and there are other Italians that side against Milan, and so you have this clashes between the wealth and the Ghibellines, because it's really and effectively a matter of who is gonna rule the land. And in that case, in the 14th centuries, we have already seen, and we'll keep seeing about Italy, really the situation was unchecked, and it's part of the reason, in fact, why the Italians managed to recompact the region by creating this kind of state, by basically with a major city-state swallowing all the others around, right? So in Flanders, cities didn't really have the same power. We can't even properly talk about city-states, right? Because they were still somewhat different in their historical development. But here, what we're looking at is at the League, at the force of the League in itself. And this is very meaningful because, again, there is still a county working institutionally, and still some relevant feudal elements, as we've seen, and the same clergy, etc. In the Italic kingdom, the situation is that was dramatically more statalized and centralized already, not to have essentially anybody but the city carrying out the whole freaking thing without any even higher order, right? And so these differences are very meaningful. Also because the Flemish exploits, as we've seen very often when talking about this area, in fact, the French have made a video about the Battle of Courtrai, etc., and the same Flemish tactics, etc. There was a big outburst of, in fact, Ghent, Brugge, and Ypres, etc., against the French. But did this bring to a further statalization of the land? No, right? The actual state that took form were the lowlands, in fact, under the Valois Burgundy that effectively took over Flanders, right? So it's as if it had been the same French, because technically they were the same French royal dynasty and just another line. So that's a narrative that usually in Belgium is not very much stressed, but it's actually very concrete. Also because those cities would be soundly defeated by the Burgundian armies later on, right? And they had the same, were still French feudally based armies, that the same ones that the Flemish had defeated at Courtrai. So there is not really a parallelism you can draw, just celebrating that as an absolute achievement of that military model, because the rest of basically only Courtrai, right? Montpellier a bit showed that too, but from there on, basically up to Guinegate, at the end of the 15th century, the Flemish were exclusively defeated by in all battles they fought. So that's kind of very important for debunking the myth of infantry as the arm of the future, the late Middle Ages as the rise of commoners and of freedom. No, it's diametrically opposed, right? And this narrative, it's very hard to die because of a much broader overlook on the Middle Ages and the order that they embodied, that was connected also to some religious side, let's say, ecclesiological modern. So this had become episodes of modernity and secularization, but as a matter of fact, they were really not, right? And it's a gross misunderstanding of the medieval art of war not to be able to distinguish the commoners' infantries of the early 14th century and the late, the mid on 15th century onwards, pike squares that are, essentially professionals hired by the princes, and something completely different. way beyond the same military big difference, of course, that existed between the two. And in Germany, instead, where the cities had demonstrated some economical and political vivacity, the cities had actually less liberty. By naturally different degrees, because first of all, the empire was big, right? It was this major Central European landmass that covered this mostly Germanic areas, as you know, also Bohemia, and that had essentially by this point not achieved a unitary public kind of monarchic profile, right? It was after the the extinction of the Hohenstaufen line basically collapsed, and already before that, right, along the lines of a private based reality, right? The German kings had de facto never been able to control more than kind of half of Germany loosely, and mostly they had instead concentrated their effort to consolidate their power in the Italian peninsula. In practice, this is evident, in fact, along those lines that, in fact, divide Germany, as we were saying before, like the northeastern and southwestern part that were respectively the least and the most developed, and that, in fact, had also, in terms of urbanism, quite of a different development, because, like in the Rhineland, in southern Germany, these were essentially the Romanized areas. The cities had always played an important part, and they developed, right, quite remarkably. And especially in this situation of political fragmentation, they enjoyed at times important autonomies. I mean, think about Cologne. It was one of the largest cities in Europe, and there were also leagues of cities that were created, in part the same Swiss Confederacy. That's how it had been formed. Also, think about the Swabian League. They were different. The Rhineland one. These were the most important areas. In fact, as you see, southwestern Germany. In practice, the extent, however, of the German cities' power went very loosely, if not at all, out of the city gates. Right, at some point, the Saint Cologne was archbishopric, and as we will see here, like Defoe, one of the most important electors of the empire, and before the Golden Bull sanctioned it formally, had expelled the bishop, right, that retained this enormous seigneury, however, all around the city. And this is the characteristic of the German cities, because they could enjoy, in fact, an important, trade capacity, etc., but they wouldn't be able factually to extirpate from the surroundings the princely presence. That is to say, either prince or bishop. The countryside was under an aristocratic force that the city was not able to dislodge, and this has to do, of course, by European standards, with the lesser degree of urbanism in Central Europe, but also because, of course, the unchecked spread of properly princely rule after the collapse of that public system that, at least up to the death of Frederick II formally, and part of his successors, had remained standing, right? Already under Frederick, as you know, the emperor bails out from the defense of many public rights. Basically, he sold them to the princes in exchange for money, right, and power that therefore could be employed by the same Hohenstaufen at that point to the construction of a private power, rather than enforcing like the functioning of a public system that worked no more. Also because, in fact, the same princes and cities, etc., had become largely, had really expanded in power. At that point, even the same clergy that had been supported, generally speaking, of the royal power, starts making policy on their own, because they are basically temporal rulers as much as this is particularly evident in Germany itself, right? As it was noticed abroad that the German bishops were de facto lords. They were also pretty warlike. They lived just like the rest of the aristocracy, and this had rendered objectively inconvenient to keep investing on that great dream of national monarchy like in England and France. But it's exactly this hybrid of the German monarchy, its electivity, the swinging control of the various imperial dynasties on the German kingdom, and the ever decreasing one already by the late Hohenstaufen era, that had brought the same public authority to issue a lot of charters declaring imperial city rights. That is to say, the Freie Reichsstädte, that would be as basically actually also other powers, including lay and ecclesiastical ones, the direct, let's say, the lack of any medium with the monarchy. That is to say, they responded directly to the sovereign, and as such, if attacked, etc., the monarch took on the responsibility of protecting and defending them. And in many ways, of course, this varied in effectiveness because of the same reason that we have issued. But in the particular political fragmentation of Germany, we're talking about 300 states, something like that. So some of were very small, even on the map. It was possible for certain cities to carve a niche of some sort to preserve, in that sense, because also of the weakness of the surrounding seigneuries, some sort of autonomy, but not really topping it dramatically like in other, like for example territorial lords themselves, right, which was an exception. Just you see that basically in the Italian communes, right? In the rest, nobody really did it ever. There was always some kind of feudal power around, and this is in fact what Germany remains, so much that the historiographically is called princely Germany at this point, for this phase of the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages. And the city, so it's fair to say that the cities depended in large measure by the constitutional developments that had followed the crumbling of the Swabian dynasty in the mid-13th century and the ensuing long period of Interregnum, right? This latter aspect is somewhat overly emphasized. Normally, we think there was, of course, a major crash that you would have simply seen in Germany happening, but the thing happened in a much longer period in time, and again was already there since ever, in a way. Let's say that the moment in which the same Swabians started going down was effectively after Legnano in 1176, but also the death of Henry VI, later on the minority of Frederick II, that really engulfed the country into a spiral of violence and instability from which essentially Germany wouldn't come out anymore. And for 1 century, in fact, up to the Golden Bull, there is not even a formal order issued. There hadn't been before. In fact, the same Interregnum, first of all, the mid 13th century, we're talking about the death of Frederick II. There is all the phase of Conrad. There is the story of Conradin, right? So it's not until the death of Conradin in 68, right? The rise of Rudolf of Habsburg, properly at least victorious against the major competitors, namely Bohemia. It's 1278. It's not this complete lack of order or even monarchic or even dynastic continuity by a certain degree, right? So if this thing had happened, I don't know, in a country like France or England, you would have seen a much greater absolute damage in interest of concentration of time, let's say, in the process. In Germany, instead, it was kind of softly just accelerating those processes of public disgregation that had already been default in many areas, but especially again in the northeast. What was really the capacity of the monarchy to ever, or the interest for that matter, the profit for the monarchy to invest in there. So it's really an important element. For example, for the sake of city autonomy as a topic, the same ANSA had been developing on the Baltic, on the North Sea, exactly because of kind of the secular weakness, right? Not just the weakness of the, let's say, of the monarchy in general, and not just the German one, but also the Scandinavian ones in the north, but also of the surrounding lordships, right? Formerly, they were actually under a lord, but which lord would have spent who knows what just to besiege a city like Lübeck or Hamburg? Not that it couldn't happen in theory, but let's say there the urban and trade development was possible as long as, in fact, the German powers and the Scandinavian ones were weak enough for it to dwell. And eventually, when they reinforced by the end of the Middle Ages, the early modern age, the Hanseatic League declined shortly afterwards. So it's not even a real model of, let's say, of again, we can't even talk properly about city-states, because as a matter of fact, their power, especially in the case of the ANSA, was the sum of the cities altogether, like a league rather than anything. So I personally look at great interest and even admiration by a certain degree, actually, to the development of the private powers from that mess, actually, up from, in fact, the mid-13th to the mid-14th century. As you know, the Germanic Empire would remain a very complicated thing for centuries to come. It would never reunite until the 19th century, let's say. It didn't even exist anymore in other very different times, and basically at the hands of a power like Prussia. But the same thing could have been possible by Austria, because those were German dynasties that, however, built their own power and their own true states outside of Germany at large, right? So this is famous. I mean, think about before the Zollverein, the properly the reunification of Germany and such, how difficult and complicated, how much even in unified Germany is kind of heterogeneous nature of the country remained, with different states actually that mirrored in part. I don't know, Hitler was king of Prussia, just institutionally, because by default the German state had to maintain the title. I mean, this kind of things that we really don't talk much about modern contemporary history, but there are independent states today, city-states today in Germany as well. Think about Bremen, Hamburg, etc. And so the interesting aspect is, again, how you reach the mid-14th century as an affirmation of certain statal prerogatives in Germany, and properly the affirmation of the necessity to maintain those states undivided, right? Even when they didn't actually belong to the imperial dynasty that issued this same charters. As we'll see, the Golden Bull was essentially a Luxembourg political move, and also a pretty clever one, because it managed to oust from the electoral rights the Habsburgs, for example, also kind of bypassing in some way the one of the Wittelsbachs. In any case, making a bit of a lift backwards, let's say the emperors of the last 30 years of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th formally exploited their imperial prerogatives in order to strengthen the private fortunes of their own family. Again, the Hohenstaufen had already started. There were important dynastic powers already before, historically. Think about the Welfen, that kind of at some point evaporated, also because they were ousted by the Hohenstaufen, which really succeeded, at least to break the Saxon-Bavarian axis But for example, there were the Babenberg that were not just a very powerful, but also, an old family, but one that had managed to create in Austria a very orderly administration alongside the feudal pattern, of course, but still importantly for those areas, and everybody sought to seize their inheritance. Frederick II wanted that, right? The dream of the Hohenstaufen would have been to create a Swabian Austrian empire, so controlling all southern Germany, the Alpine passes, of major political and strategical significance for the Italian crown and everything. And also that say finished before the same Babenbergs, whose legacy was contended by the Bohemians and the Austrians. Ottokar II of Bohemia, at some point Bohemia, still the Przemysl dynasty, it became factually the most powerful reality in the empire after during the Interregnum proper. Right, they took over all southeastern Germany, even some part of northeastern Italy. They consolidated an enormous power by absorbing the Babenberg inheritance, and it was just in fact, kind of the German backlash that initially supported Rudolf of Habsburg, that had at that point also papal support, because actually Bohemia now was allied with the Anjou, and the popes were kind of repenting of having taken out the Hohenstaufen by some degree at least. And when the Habsburgs actually won the first campaign in 1276 against the Bohemians, seizing Austria and Styria and Carinthia, all the other Germans bailed out, say, wait, slow down. Like, we supported you to take out Ottokar, but now you are too powerful. And so there was the final showdown, the Battle of Markfeld, 1278, where factually the Habsburgs won thanks to essentially their Swabian and Austrian support, and also importantly the Hungarian one, and killed Ottokar on the field. And so there was all a phase after that with a dynastic continuity. Rudolf secured southeastern Germany, so basically shifted the Habsburg power from what is essentially today's Switzerland, those Alsace, those areas, as they were traditionally Swabian, just as most of these dynasties, like including the Hohenzollern, for example, then ended up in Brandenburg. And after there was Albert, his son, was assassinated by Adolf of Nassau. Then there were interesting backs and forths, but at that point, for example, the Habsburgs took the Bohemian, even the Polish crown at some point. At the beginning of the 14th century, were incredibly powerful. And so this shows you that, at least in Germany, there was a lot of this were mostly the sum of dynastic possessions rather than actual conquest, right? And in Central Europe, this would become a leitmotif, especially in the late Middle Ages. Look at what happened between Austria, Bohemia, Poland, Hungary. And it's part of the result of what we're seeing now, of the Golden Ball. But it was already in the air, but it was a real power, right? And this is overlooked because eventually there was a contraction later on. But in part, Germany might have, say, as always, you see also in the economic revival of the High Middle Ages, like it kind of arrived a bit later, but a bit stronger, right? These countries like England, Germany were kind of overall less rich than, say, France or Italy, but in the Middle Ages rose in relative terms more than them, right? And so even this political vitality and capacity, that was not, really distant from the other European countries, and especially the Western ones, but was manifested for an important amount of time, also in the second half of the 13th century in Germany, as probably the project of a monarchic power. Rudolf of Habsburg spent himself to destroy literally 70 castles in the Rhineland in order to tame the rebel nobility. There was an important effort. Initially, this shows you that by the end of the 13th century, the beginning of the 14th, still, German monarchs believed in the national monarchy thing, right? They just, however, importantly, were starting to build it mostly from a private base. And even this is Is this so strange and odd? Well, frankly not, because all the German imperial dynasties had been, of course, and as any other dynasty anywhere in Europe, backed by important private possessions. I mean, Otto I's accomplishments could have not been possible without his father's massive encapsulation process. Henry the Fowler was a dramatic politician, commander, administrator. The same goes for, I don't know, Frederick Barbarossa's father, same homonymous, who after, he bailed out of the imperial election because he lost an eye, was not physically fit for that by law, spent the rest of his life building castles for paving the road to his son's rise. I mean, the same Franconians came from the Salians. I mean, came from a very important and strong background. So it was normal in many ways. It's just that, again, from the Hohenstaufen onwards, formally, public prerogatives were even properly sold. So at an ideological level, that was a very strong proof that the political thermometer was shifted towards the collapse of public institutions again. And there was not really too much could be done. In fact, even the impersonation of some kind of hegemonic role was still done not much because of the public thing, but because of the power. And especially in the German mindset that in many ways had remained a bit less secularized and modernized at the time. This was the concept of the Imperium. In fact, as we will see, one of the striking aspects of the Golden Bull is that this document was the first one in which the principle of majority of the electors was ever expressed in German institutional history, meaning that the early elections technically represented the entirety of the Imperium, right? Lots of people participated to these places, not just lords with their retinues, entire armies, etc., but literally, it was also the stand of the knights per se. There were lots of other, lots of people would have just to join and show the actual force of one faction or another, even coming from the other. This was even coming from other countries. This is very interesting. Where you find, I don't know, vassals from northern Italy that participated to the German election. That is to say, the German king, not the Italic one that eventually should have been crowned when the German king elected king of the Romans in Aachen would have come to Italy. So this shows how important, in a way, was that for still showing off power. And this is because it was measuring real power. It was factually no need even to formally say it's about the majority. It's about the strength. This is really what the Imperium substantiated itself in, where you could have, let's say, one guy that wanted to become the emperor, and if all the rest of the princes were weak, he could take them entirely over. There was no principle saying, no, those guys were the majority, right? There was no democratic principle in the minds of these people. It was completely alien to their culture. They didn't know what it was. It never had never existed. So, as we will see, in fact, also what was sanctioned by the Golden Bull was putting a patch on a situation was just brutally evident at that point. That is, the risk of further fragmentation by a certain degree. But this didn't happen, and actually the fact that the same bull was issued, as we will see, was the proof that some broader, by private, doesn't really matter, states had taken shape, right? But it is true that they were at risk of fragmentation. We'll see better how. Now, this thing of exploiting imperial prerogatives in favor of private interests is especially evident in the Habsburgic policy, right? There were, as we'll see now, a couple of other families that were the most important one, the Luxembourgs, that factually were created by Germany to counter the Habsburgs properly, because the Habsburgs at least had conquered their own kingdoms. They had risked their own very existence at that point. The Luxembourgs were just placed on the throne of Bohemia after the Przemyslids extinguished, and so they were a very successful anti-Habsburgic creation, by the way, because they would become, as you know, under the St. Charles IV, and think about the University of Prague and the St. Golden Bull. it would make of Bohemia the heart of 14th century Europe in many ways. But they began that randomly. In fact, yet another dynamic that we have appreciated in other videos is this shifting towards the east of some, in fact, minor dynasties. I mean, the Habsburgs were known as the little counts. They were a modest nobility. They just distinguished themselves. This is also a German trend, because they had been loyal to the last, to the dying ruling dynasty. The Hohenstaufen had made the Habsburg factually rising, as the Franconians, the Salians, had made the Hohenstaufen rising from very modest power, actually, just because they had been the most loyal, right, and making them marry into royalty and becoming the next dynasty. So that also shows a bit how random things could go, and how unpredictable and unstable the system was. But the reason why this Western nobility or knightly dynasties in that very intricate forest of feudal jurisdiction, etc., would move east is kind of evident, because the eastern you went, and the more you could find territories that were somewhat that had paradoxically been less feudalized, that for some reason, namely because feudalism had moved from west to east, so just in the east it was less present, or because in fact those areas also in the Western Slavic countries, I mean, think about the same Bohemia where the Luxembourg settled, were traditionally in fact less privatized and fragmented. Like the Western Slavic dynasties, also Hungary, kind of emerged a bit later as powers and without the feudal background, right? So namely, at least, they were even better placed than some German areas to become the leading ones. In fact, the extraordinary life of Ottokar II is kind of a testament to that. So also for the Anjou, for example, moving in Hungary, the Habsburgs in Austria, that yes was German and feudalized, but also kind of less than as we've seen the West, and the Luxembourgs in Bohemia really tell a story. You can see a pattern there, right? Of dynasties that were de facto also kind of cold there, because even in Austria, right, it was the local ministerialists that really dictated the balance of power, right, in by some degree. The same goes for the ethnic aristocracies of Hungary or Bohemia, reason for which these powers, as you know, at least the Central European ones like Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, would kind of fail as let's say centralized monarchies in the modern age, whereas the West managed to consolidate ever more a subtle form, right, in dynastic stability. Those ones kind of fragmented in favor of the oligarchy, of the private powers. Even the Habsburgs had trouble with that, because again they not just they fragmented themselves during the Middle Ages dynastically, that happened to the Wittelsbachs too, etc., but they still had to rule if they wanted to expand much on areas like Bohemia. That would give troubles over the same breakout of the 30 Years' War, things like this. So this is one of those areas that, as you know, took a great effort and properly developed a different political culture from what we are habituated in kind of a more westernmost sense. Mostly the model really is Britain and France, right? Even Spain is already different. Even Italy, of course, is different. Germany is different, but really the Middle European dimension is peculiar on its own, right, in many ways historically, and this is very much overlooked. And actually in favor of this kind of lack of unity, which is a price that those areas had eventually to pay in a way or another in modern contemporary history. In any case, the Habsburgs were the biggest winner in a sense, at least on the longer run. They weren't faring dramatically well, especially in 1356 when the Golden Bull was issued, and we'll explain why. but they had managed to score the biggest hit fundamentally and to secure it by expanding from the High Rhine, where they originally came from, to Austria and seizing all of it, and Styria and Carinthian parts, even of Tyrol later on. Very complicated feudal issues that were always battled on in Germany, the dynastic policies and so on. The Luxembourg also scored a very big hit, but in a way, maybe because of the nature of Bohemia itself, that initially seemed so promising, because the nobility was, at least the state came from a recent past of monarchic power, but at least the nobility, even through the same process of Westernization, was already very powerful again. It would increase, and so Bohemia, as you know, fell dramatically from the golden age of the mid 14th century into the Hussite wars that basically made it kind of a second, say, a B-rate power fundamentally in the 15th century. But the events of Henry VII, that was also actually the last Holy Roman Emperor to wage an Italian campaign worth this name, right? That was very unfortunate in the way it took form, and it was really already showing kind of the difficulties of the Germanic rulers to resume the Mediterranean policy. But it's also it's really overlooked, right? You can see the real, shrinking in power by the following expeditions of Ludwig of Wittelsbach and of the John of Bohemia, the same father of Charles IV, that were not much more than kind of adventures, right? Henry VII still could somewhat from a moment to another, this Luxembourg dynasty, gather enough consensus to be able to significantly threaten even Angevin Naples and recover what the Swabian legacy that at that point had been kind of already idealized in the imperial mythology as the great, the lion one, let's say, was old. And Henry ruled from 1308 to 1313, also relatively a few. But again, the first thing he does is getting into Italy again, not into Germany by the same scale, right, of military action. His imperial commitment in Italy definitely remembered the Swabian tradition. And Henry, however, also managed to strengthen his house, right? Because it's in 1311 that the Luxembourgs installed themselves on the Bohemian throne, formerly held by the Czech nobility. Now, under Henry's successor, that was Ludwig the Bavarian, Ludwig of Wittelsbach, so successor to the imperial throne, not to the Luxembourg dynasty, there was also, as you know, and we've made many videos about this, recrudescence, we could say, of the ideological clash with the papacy. At this point, the popes were in Avignon. They were in many ways at the peak of their power, or at least probably from a secular, even probably material point of view. We were just talking about that yesterday. They waged a war against Milan at some point, trying to take over the entire Lombardy. That's where also the Bavarian got involved in the situation. And even the same Ludwig, with a particular eye of regard to Italy, to all the German mercenaries that were fighting there, because it was still a way to reaffirm some kind of universal legacy there. While factually, under his great opponent was Pope John the 22nd, one of the greatest popes in medieval times. You have the exactly in those years are peculiar properly in the shrinking of both the papal and imperial power further, right? In actual material capacity, it's as if this system of Europe had exhausted itself. and as you know, in a few decades, the 100-Year War would have engulfed France. Like, lots of things would start going pretty bad, even just before the plague struck, etc. Ludwig was an effective ruler. He managed to defeat his cousin, Frederick the Fair of Habsburg. They were their grandfather was Rudolf of Habsburg, both of them, because also, by the way, the Hohenstaufen eventually lived on, at least on the female lineage, and then also in the Wittelsbachs, especially Conradin's mother was a Wittelsbach, just to make an example, and also the Habsburgs with the Wittelsbachs, with the Luxembourg and so on. It was kind of normal. They hoped to gain something, to even if they hated each other, they hoped for some accident, biological or dynastic, political accident that would inherit maybe an entire kingdom in the process, as it would happen at some point later on, especially. And in fact, this is a bit the leitmotif of the whole thing that is evidenced by the Golden Bull itself, that even if these powers competed among each other, at least the oligarchization, the feudalization of power brought on the fore the necessity to, paradoxically, not much clash against each other horizontally as different powers, but kind of clashing against the classes that were oppressing in a way, to affirm their ever more centralized power, so marrying into each other internationally as much as they could, so that they could reinforce their own superiority dynastically, by feudal right, etc., claiming the rights on these various kingdoms. So at some point they managed even to sum in large numbers, so that in practice they wouldn't actually control but one of them, that the one that were better established, or where they transferred what was the richest, the better administrable at that time, and cash in a little bit from the others, so that they could at least use that surplus to centralize in one of their possessions. But as you know, the situation wouldn't, especially after mid-14th century crisis, wouldn't really improve. Entire states collapsed, like Bohemia, as we were saying before. So lots of issues would rise again to torment this dynasties and the general international picture. What happened under Ludwig, among the other things, the general criticism of papal temporal prerogatives, the development of Bavaria, especially of Munich as a main center, etc. Ludwig was a capable individual, but there was the formalization also of the Germanization of the empire from an institutional point of view. In other words, what was happening is that the Germans were bailing out, especially of the universal policy, and given that, and they understood that albeit they would always maintain kind of their interest at an international level, right? We've seen it with Italy, we've seen it with other countries, etc. But they understood that their main, their fortune, their future was in Germany, at least in Central Europe, right? In these areas that they could also, with the mid-14th century crisis, there's a shrinking properly of the territorial reach, even just of the strategic projection, right? So this German dynasties kind of felt themselves re-entrenching to the regional landscape of Germany and Central Europe, to try to, in fact, give even a more rationalized compaction to their dominions, right? Until imperial capabilities were of universal scale, it was easy to kind of, let's say, be supported by lots of people also in other countries that could pay and support your action because they wanted you to crush their next door neighbor, right? That's how the Ottonians had done, that's how the Hohenstaufen had done. And so the need also to pursue that public prerogative, etc., was also kind of rendered possible by the greater availability of resources in the moment of booming of Europe, all these things, and hadn't brought, if you wonder why Germany was so fragmented in 300 states, aside from the pregress, history of the country, is also because nobody had, as we've seen, really bet on the centralization there. The Germanic rulers wanted to centralize their power in Rome, in Palermo, wherever they could in the south, in the Mediterranean. because that was their goal. Being closer to the Holy Land, to Constantinople, reuniting East and West from there, right? Germany was not really the best place to do it from. Now it becomes, also because Germany develops in the meanwhile. As we were saying before, Germany at this point surpasses Italy in population. It starts developing consistently, right? It's not that everything goes well, but let's say it manages to even expand its own. Like there is a moment of great, for example, we were making that video about Silesia recently. We have seen how Germanization wasn't stopped by the mid 14th century crisis, colonization, settlement, exactly because of the crisis in many ways. There was an expansive capacity. The same ministerialist class, the serfs, knights serfs, let's say, typical of Germany, had undergone a crisis because of the rise of this major feudal dynasties, and so they went bankrupt. And that's why, speaking of mercenary companies, soldiers of fortune, you find so many Germans, especially in Italy, these major companies of thousands of men. These were coming all from, and interestingly enough, not even from the most advanced areas. They came from Swabia, from the Rhineland, right? So there were lots of people that, in those places that had even attracted more population, maybe were suffering the most from the crisis, needed to find job elsewhere. This made, in theory, making some money abroad and then coming back to Germany, because there wasn't really a settlement abroad, at least in the south. In the east, yes, as we have seen, the Ostsiedlung went on. So this mechanism starts. There is some improvement also in the international trade for Germany, specifically for Bavaria, because when the 100 Years' War engulfed the France, and especially the Rhone Valley, that had been traditionally the highway between the Champagne fairs and Flanders and Tuscany, etc., is cut off. Basically, the Genoese take the Atlantic route; they go to England, and also the Atlantic coast of Spain that develops Seville. The Venetians instead opened the continental route with Bavaria across the Alps, and in fact, there was an important German presence also in Venice. As you know, there is the famous Fondaco of the Germans. Banking is a big deal, especially in southern Germany, in fact. And in general, in fact, southern Germany is the most important area at this point. And it's not a surprise that the Wittelsbachs and the Habsburgs dwell there and kind of resist there in spite of all the difficulties. And there is properly thrown around the concept of Sacrum Romanum Imperium Germanische Nationes. That is to say, that suffix, that is to say, Holy Roman Empire of the Germanic nation that had not found a formalization before in the documents, etc., starts being used, because Ludwig of Bavaria especially stated that fundamentally it was not necessary to be crowned by the Pope in order to become emperor, right? Which factually didn't quite work in the same way, but let's say that it showed how now the Germans would mostly make German policy, would essentially try to strengthen their own authority for their own national issues, right? And from within them, right? And not really seeking much of international recognition of this process. It's an important step in the process of modernization and secularization, which we will explain now better also with the Golden Ball. In fact, what we're seeing now is the acquisition, say, of the greater awareness of the necessity of a coordination founded on the binomium emperor and princes. Because if you really wanted to exercise a factual power in Germany, you had necessarily to, at that point, to cooperate with these private forces. And naturally, and paradoxically, actually, at the same time, the more powerful these princes were individually, the better you could have a dialogue with them, right? You want to compact them so at least you know who they are, and you know that the more powerful they are, that yes, they can compete with you, but they can also kind of be of your same status, and thus reinforcing the status per se, So you can win in part from that, as we were saying before. So this is the logic from which the collegium of the 7 great electors stems. So this was sanctioned by the Golden Bull of Charles IV of 1356, which formulated precise norms that regulated the prerogatives of the great electors that now were properly fixed. In fact, in the 7 ones that were famously enough the ecclesiastical ones, so the most important archbishoprics Germany were Cologne, Trier, and Mainz, that had already been kind of always some of the most important electors since ever in German history. And that's where the Luxembourgs played a bit. They were really clever, actually, but they caused further attrition in many ways at their benefit, at least for a while, because they spotted in the 4 lay electors not actually some of the greatest powers, right? These were the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duchy of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the same Kingdom of Bohemia. So what's the logic of this? First of all, you see that there are apparently 2 major houses here cut out, after at least Bohemia under the Luxembourgs was, especially at that point, the most powerful. Also because we made a video about Charles IV's election. He had to surpass many opposition. He kind of reversed, he turned the tide, right? You know, at least it seemed impossible. Eventually also because he was lucky, lots of his opponents literally died of natural causes, actually. And so became the most powerful prince in the empire, an enormous one, right? Was supported by the papacy in the process, and also that caused some malaise, at least considering how powerful it became later on and how he didn't even obey the papacy more than much. In any case, where is Bavaria? Where is Austria? These were really very important, especially the latter. So the logic was the following. Okay, the ecclesiastic electors were just traditional, and it would have been impossible just to leave them out. They were concentrated in the Rhineland, and okay, there was always a political negotiation. Among the other things, the Golden Bull says that the election at the Diet had to happen within 30 days. Otherwise, the electors would have been closed, a bit like the papal election with the cardinals, closed with just bread and water, right up until they decided. And this means that in that month, people would meet and they would negotiate on lots of things. They brokered their adjustments for the election, for the future, and so on. Then you have Count Palatinate of the Rhine and the Margrave of Brandenburg. That at the time, and this makes things a bit clearer, were actually owned by a branch of the Wittelsbachs. But you don't see Bavaria. The reason why this was happening is that Charles IV was actually allied with the Wittelsbachs at the time against the Habsburgs, or at least more or less, because still the Wittelsbachs, tried to struggle depending on the situation. Nobody liked each other. They were just together because of contingencies. And so Charles IV said that since the Wittelsbach dynasty was split at that time, we've seen it in the recent video about the Duchy of Bavaria that I made, and that was a real problem because you have Bavaria literally all parceled in 4 disarticulated parts that were objectively the duchy also lost in importance for some time. They were all quarreling among each other, fighting against each other, and so on. At least he recognized Charles was a fox. The most important assets that were at least formally in in the hands of a single branch of the Wittelsbachs. So the Count, the Palatinate, and the Margravate of Brandenburg in the northeast. They weren't dramatic powers, but they per se, again, but they were the Wittelsbachs. So at least this was a way, okay, I recognize you as formally an elector, This 7 electors couldn't be changed. You see, this was the meaning of the constitution that remained for centuries. Not even the Habsburgs an inch later. So much, in fact, that the Habsburgs would become electors of the Holy Roman Empire only in 1526. Not because Austria ever was an elector, but because they at that year they became kings of Bohemia that had maintained at that point the Luxembourgs were no more. But the Habsburgs in fact had controlled the place and consequently achieved their fort of secular electoral power. As for Saxony, I don't remember really, but the concept here was very simple. That the only giving two votes to the Wittelsbachs was important, but they were still kind of quarreling each other, so you could really play on them. While Bohemia was a kingdom, factually, within the same empire. It's interesting that the Pope let it happen. Innocent IV was not really much fond of the empire just by tradition in the Papal States, but so he didn't say anything. Notice there was no Italian elector. It was a German thing, plus Bohemia, because Bohemia was traditionally so much incorporated within the Germanness of the empire that still, worked like that. And in any case, in fact, the most powerful state in the empire was Bohemia at the time, so it couldn't really be out. But the Habsburgs were not there, and the Habsburgs at this time were already also split into two main lines that they would kind of, in fact, fragment further the fate of these dynasties, right? Feudal inheritance law there was always present, so the descendants was a huge deal. And even though, again, these families were already split dynastic, different branches, which meant literally a fragmentation of the house in various different powers, the fact that the Habsburgs were not represented, the Duchy of Austria, let's put it in this way, was the most important possession of the Habsburgs, was not attached any electoral right, contributed to the struggle of the Habsburgs. That in fact would take a while, up to the mid-15th century, before they reunited everything and became so powerful anyhow at that point to manage finally essentially to monopolize the imperial election for centuries to come. And one of the most important aspects of the Golden Bull is that it prohibited explicitly the division of the electoral territories. That is, the multiplication of the votes. This is of radical importance because it shows a need to maintain that order, right? Even though things could change on the long run, even biologically, the same Habsburgs that take over Bohemia, because the Luxembourgs have simply flowed in that inheritance and are no more. But there was a need to have some points of reference. There were some states that would have had to remain compact, unaltered, right? That's also why at that point Charles couldn't recognize the Duchy of Bavaria as an elector, because it was factually split already, while Brandenburg and the Palatinate weren't. This aspect naturally deteriorated further the situation, in fact, of those lands like Bavaria and Austria that had not received such prerogative, because there was always almost a kind of a external pressure to keep the electoral states together, and the others really wouldn't seem at the moment at least to like capable of regaining compaction. At least the Habsburgs made it in the end. There were also lots of regalia of the princes that were consolidated. That is to say, the Golden Bull sanctioned some kind of rights that had previously belonged to the public authority, the king, in Germany, or the the same emperor in a way. Not because the emperor was no more, but because, as we've seen, part of that public rights had been shared or sold to the princes. So princes that were ever more elevated to a status of royalty, de facto. Because, I mean, let's be honest, so aside, again, from the largest monarchies here in Europe, even a state like Bohemia was like an important power. The Duchy of Milan was an important power. The idea of having some kind of royal ambition was, after all, in the heads of all these people, all these dynasties. And so this was a way, as we were saying before, to recognize a above status, let's say, that could be boasted by just these few families, so contributing to reinforce them, contributing to kind of strengthening the ties at the top between these international players, and as we will see, especially in the 15th century, allowing, in fact, some alliances between the same powers at the expense not much of other powers, but of the same stands, of the same estates, I mean, in classes of the territories that they ruled, because naturally these powers faced internal opposition as well, because the prerogatives of the sovereigns now were much greater, and they could exact more taxes and tolls, etc. So this at some point brought to some of these dynasties allying themselves also to crush internal opposition in the process, and so strengthening further, right? And so the Golden Bull is part of the aforementioned, not just refutalization of Europe, but of crystallization of the Ancien Regime. Because factually the states were recognized here, at least if not the single ones, but at least the type of states that would eventually emerge would have been essentially the same states that we can see, not today, because again in this case Germany is, actually yes, because it's a federal republic, so it has a sum actually of states that are still maintaining, in part, there is a common constitution, but then at the lower level they are basically all administering themselves as autonomously in deference to this political tradition of the land, of the single Länder, as a matter of fact. So if we talk about Bavaria, okay, Austria makes the difference there, because I always treat it as Germany, and so Austrians now will want to kill me. But factually, right, that's partly a confirmation of this, because Austria became a state on its own. And so never underestimate this aspect of Middle European culture, and I hope to talk again about these topics, because they're really important and fascinating and overlooked, as always. Lots of things, too many things, the most important ones nobody really gives a damn about. However, for today, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.